Autumn 1942, London, Combined Operations Headquarters. A 232-page memorandum arrives by diplomatic bag on Lord Louis Mountbatten's desk. 2 notes are attached. The first warns Mountbatten to read it before letting anyone else near it. The second reads, "It may be gold. It may only glitter. I have been hammering at it too long and am blinded." Inside is a proposal to build an aircraft carrier, 2,000 feet long and 300 feet wide, displacing 2.2 million tons out of frozen wood pulp and ice. Not steel, not aluminium, ice. Reinforced with sawdust and kept frozen by a refrigeration plant the size of 4 power stations. The man who wrote it was not an engineer. He was not a naval architect. He was a bankrupt civilian with no formal scientific training who had talked his way onto Mountbatten's staff by opening with the words, "Lord Mountbatten, you need me on your staff because I am a man who thinks." His name was Geoffrey Pyke. His concept was Project Habakkuk. And within 6 months, Winston Churchill himself would stamp the file "Most Secret" and action this day, ordering it be given the highest priority in the British war effort. The material at the heart of the proposal would stop rifle bullets, resist bomb blasts, and refuse to melt in a bathtub full of hot water. A working prototype would be built in a Canadian lake, survive an entire summer on a single 1-horsepower motor, and take 3 years to melt after the refrigeration was switched off. How did a frozen block of sawdust and ice come closer to reshaping the Royal Navy than any other unconventional weapon of the Second World War? To understand why Britain's most senior military leaders took an ice aircraft carrier seriously, you need to understand how close the country came to starvation in 1942. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous campaign of the war, running from September 1939 to May 1945. Britain imported over 1 million tons of material every week to survive. Food, fuel, ammunition. Raw materials for every weapon, every vehicle, every aircraft the country produced. German U-boats, hunting in coordinated wolf packs, aimed to sever that lifeline completely. 1942 was catastrophic. U-boats sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping in the Atlantic alone, roughly 1,160 vessels. During the first 8 months of that year, the period the Kriegsmarine called the Second Happy Time, 868 ships totaling 3.1 million tons went to the bottom. Only 42 U-boats were destroyed in return. The root cause was a 300 to 600 mile wide stretch of the mid-North Atlantic. Convoy sailors called it the Black Pit. This was the zone beyond effective range of land-based aircraft from North America, Iceland, and the British Isles. U-boats exploited it ruthlessly. They surfaced freely to recharge batteries, coordinated attacks by radio, and struck convoys with minimal risk of detection from the air. RAF Coastal Command begged for long-range Liberator bombers. Bomber Command refused to release them. By March 1943, the crisis peaked. In the first 20 days of that month, 120 ships were sunk, 82 of them in the Atlantic. Only 12 U-boats were destroyed. The Admiralty considered abandoning the convoy system entirely. Royal Navy historian Stephen Roskill later wrote that the Germans never came so near to severing communications between the New World and the Old. Churchill put it more bluntly. He later wrote that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. The numbers told the full story. In 1942, Britain possessed roughly 700,000 tons of steel shipbuilding capacity. Every ton committed to a new warship was a ton unavailable for merchant replacements. Every merchant ship sunk faster than a replacement could be launched, widened the gap between survival and collapse. The country was losing ships 3 times faster than it could build them. American yards were ramping up production under the Liberty Ship program, but the Atlantic crossing still had to be survived. The problem was clear. Britain needed air cover over the mid-Atlantic gap. Conventional fleet carriers were desperately needed in the Mediterranean and the Pacific. Escort carriers were only beginning production and would not reach meaningful numbers until late 1943. Long-range Liberator bombers were being hoarded by Bomber Command for the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris refused to divert them to maritime patrol, and every month hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping disappeared beneath the gray Atlantic waves. The idea of building unsinkable mid-ocean platforms had been proposed before. In 1940, a plan to flatten the tops of icebergs and use them as aircraft staging posts was briefly considered and abandoned. Another proposal suggested towing Arctic ice to the convoy routes. Both were dismissed as impractical. Geoffrey Pyke believed he had something different. Build the carrier out of ice, but not ordinary ice. Reinforced ice, a composite material that could be manufactured, shaped, and maintained. Not because ice was a good material for ships, because ice was free, abundant, and did not require the steel, aluminium, and shipyard capacity that Britain could not spare, and because a hull made of reinforced ice, if thick enough, would be effectively torpedo-proof. A torpedo detonating against 40 feet of frozen composite would create a crater. The ship would pump seawater into the hole, freeze it, and repair the damage within hours. No steel hull in existence could do that. Pyke was one of the most original and tragic minds of the 20th century. Born in 1893 in Kensington, London, to a Jewish barrister who died when Geoffrey was 5, he grew up in poverty and defiance. At Wellington College, he maintained Orthodox Jewish dress among sons of army officers, enduring systematic persecution. He became an atheist at 13 and entered Pembroke College, Cambridge, to study law. At the outbreak of the First World War, the 20-year-old Pyke talked to the Daily Chronicle into sending him to Berlin as a war correspondent. He was arrested after 6 days and interned at Ruhleben camp. There he compiled statistical data on every previous escape attempt, identified common failure points, and on July 9, 1915, crawled under tennis nets using the sunset glare to blind sentries. He escaped to the Netherlands, the first Englishman to get into Germany and out again during the war. Between the wars, Pyke speculated on commodity markets, at one point controlling a quarter of Britain's tin reserves. Then he went bankrupt. He founded a radical school in Cambridge that collapsed with his finances. He helped supply mobile blood transfusion units during the Spanish Civil War. He suffered periodic severe depression. In February 1942, Mountbatten hired him as civilian director of programs at Combined Operations. MI5 and MI6 warned against it. Mountbatten overruled them, calling Pyke the most unusual and provocative man he had ever met. Pyke's first project was a scheme for armored snow vehicles that eventually became the M29 Weasel and helped create the American-Canadian 1st Special Service Force, the Devil's Brigade. But Habakkuk was the gamble that would define him. The material that made the proposal feasible came from a Brooklyn laboratory. In 1942, Hermann Mark, an Austrian-American polymer chemist at the Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn, and his assistant Walter Hohenstein discovered that mixing wood pulp into water before freezing produced a composite dramatically stronger than plain ice. The optimal ratio was approximately 14% wood pulp to 86% ice by weight. Mark understood the principle from polymer science. Brittle materials can be toughened by embedding fibers, the same way concrete is reinforced with steel rebar. Pyke found the report but could not fully interpret it. He passed it to Max Perutz, an Austrian-born crystallographer working in England, who would later win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1962. Perutz confirmed the results in a secret laboratory 5 floors underground, beneath Smithfield Meat Market in London, hidden behind screens of frozen animal carcasses, with commandos disguised as civilians serving as technicians. Perutz named the material Pykrete, a combination of pike and concrete. The test data was extraordinary. Pure ice has a compressive strength of roughly 500 pounds per square inch and a tensile strength of approximately 160 pounds per square inch. Pykrete, the reinforced ice composite, achieved a compressive strength of approximately 1,100 pounds per square inch and a tensile strength of roughly 700 pounds per square inch. That tensile figure was 4.4 times stronger than ice and nearly 3 times stronger than concrete. When Perutz fired a .303 caliber rifle bullet at a block of pure ice 2 feet square and 1 foot thick, it shattered. The same bullet fired at a Pykrete block of identical dimensions penetrated only 6.5 inches, and the block remained intact. A revolver bullet made a crater just 1 inch in diameter and half an inch deep. Pykrete also melted far slower than ice. Exposed wood pulp on the surface acted as insulation. Unlike brittle ice, Pykrete was ductile enough to be machined on a lathe, cut with tools, and shaped into structural components. It had one critical flaw: creep. Like ice, Pykrete slowly deforms under sustained load. Perutes found that deformation became negligibly small after several weeks, but only at temperatures of -15 degrees Celsius or below. Any vessel built from Pykrete would require continuous active refrigeration every hour of every day. The proposed Habakkuk Mark II design was staggering: 2,000 feet long, 300 feet wide, 40 feet of solid Pykrete hull, thick enough to be torpedo-proof, a depth of 200 feet, a draft of approximately 150 feet. Total displacement 2.2 million tons, roughly 60 to 100 times heavier than any fleet carrier afloat. The ship would carry up to 150 twin-engine bombers with a crew of 3,620. 26 electric motors mounted in external pods, because internal engines would generate too much heat for an ice hull, would produce 33,000 horsepower for a maximum speed of 7 knots. Armament included 40 dual-barreled 4.5-inch anti-aircraft turrets. Range was estimated at 7,000 miles on 5,000 tons of diesel fuel. The refrigeration system was the true engineering challenge. Thousands of miles of steel tubing circulating brine coolant, 40,000 tons of cork insulation, 300,000 tons of wood pulp, 25,000 tons of fiberboard, 35,000 tons of timber, 10,000 tons of steel for the internal framework. An estimated 35,000 workers laboring for 8 months to produce 280,000 Pykrete blocks. The rudder alone would have stood over 100 feet tall. That problem was never solved, but the ship had one theoretical advantage no conventional carrier could match: self-repair. A torpedo striking 40 feet of Pykrete would blow a crater into the hull. Damage control teams would pump seawater into the breach, pack it with wood pulp, and the refrigeration system would freeze the patch solid within hours. In theory, Habakkuk could absorb unlimited torpedo hits and repair everyone. No steel hull ever built could make that claim. A conventional carrier struck by 3 or 4 torpedoes was either sinking or heading for months in dry dock. Habakkuk would fill the hole and continue operations. The first real test came during the winter of 1943 at Patricia Lake in Jasper National Park, Alberta, Canada. The location was chosen for its consistently cold climate and extreme remoteness. Approximately 15 conscientious objectors performing alternative service constructed a prototype 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 20 feet tall, weighing roughly 1,000 tons. They were never told what they were building. They called it Noah's Ark. The structure was disguised as a boathouse with a corrugated tin roof. A single 1-horsepower motor connected to a refrigeration system kept the entire prototype frozen. Core temperatures measured by thermocouples held at -10 degrees Celsius through the height of the Canadian summer, when air temperatures regularly exceeded 30 degrees. When Mountbatten visited, he fired a shotgun at the hull. The pellets bounced off. The Pykrete held. The prototype also revealed problems. Cold flow deformation, the slow sagging of ice under its own weight, was more severe than laboratory tests had predicted. The structure required additional steel reinforcement and insulation beyond original estimates. Each revision drove costs upward. Engineers calculated that scaling from a 60-foot prototype to a 2,000-foot vessel would multiply every problem geometrically. The refrigeration demands alone would require an industrial power plant running continuously, consuming fuel at a rate that negated much of the material savings. The second test was political, and it was far more dramatic. At the Quebec Conference in August 1943, held at the Chateau Frontenac Hotel in Quebec City, Mountbatten staged a demonstration before the combined chiefs of staff. The room included Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Admiral Ernest King, General George Marshall, General Henry Hap Arnold, Air Chief Marshal Charles Portal, and Admiral Dudley Pound. Junior officers wheeled in carts bearing large blocks of ordinary ice and Pykrete. Mountbatten handed an axe to General Arnold. Arnold swung hard at the ice block and split it cleanly. Then he swung at the Pykrete. The axe rebounded violently. Arnold wrenched his arm. The Pykrete had barely chipped. Then Mountbatten drew his service revolver. He fired at the ice block. It shattered, showering the room with shards. He turned to the block on the right. He fired at the Pykrete. The bullet ricocheted. Field Marshal Brooke recorded in his diary that the bullet rebounded out of the block and buzzed round their legs like an angry bee. The round reportedly grazed the trouser leg of Admiral King before burying itself in the wall. Air Marshal Sir William Welch, waiting outside the room, heard the two shots and shouted, "My God! The Americans are shooting the British!" Guards rushed in to find Mountbatten holding a smoking pistol amid fragments of shattered ice. The third test was Churchill's favorite. Mountbatten, ordered to brief the Prime Minister at Chequers, was told Churchill was in his bath. Mountbatten replied, "Good. That is exactly where I want him to be." He dropped a block of Pykrete into the steaming water. It refused to melt. Churchill, sitting in the bath, watched the frozen block sit intact in near boiling water and ordered the project taken to the Quebec Conference immediately. Churchill's written support was emphatic. On December 7, 1942, he issued a memorandum stamped "Most Secret" and "Action this day." It read, "I attach the greatest importance to the prompt examination of these ideas. The advantages of a floating island or islands, even if only used as refueling depots for aircraft, are so dazzling that they do not at the moment need to be discussed." He ordered Habakkuk given the highest priority and envisioned ice carriers deployed off the coast of France and in the Indian Ocean. The Germans, it appears, never discovered the project. No Kriegsmarine intelligence documents regarding Habakkuk have surfaced. Secrecy was strict. Workers at Patricia Lake were never told their purpose. Research at Smithfield Meat Market was hidden behind frozen animal carcasses. In one near miss, the Superman comic strip during the week of March 29, 1943, featured Nazi battleships disguised as icebergs. Military intelligence suspected a leak, and suspicion fell on Pyke, partly because no one in the program liked him. No leak was ever confirmed. Each demonstration proved the same thing. The material was real. A bullet could not destroy it. An axe could not split it. Hot water could not melt it. A 1-horsepower motor could keep a 1,000-ton prototype frozen through a Canadian summer. The science was not the problem. If you are finding this deep dive interesting, subscribing helps more than you know. The comparison that ultimately killed Habakkuk was not against enemy designs. It was against Britain's own conventional carriers, and critically, against American industrial output. Habakkuk Mark II would have displaced 2.2 million tons, carried 150 aircraft, and made 7 knots. Construction required 300,000 tons of wood pulp, 40,000 tons of cork, 10,000 tons of steel for internal framing, and an additional vast quantity of steel for the refrigeration plant. Estimated construction time was 8 months with 35,000 workers. The initial cost estimate was £700,000. By May 1943, it had risen to $2.5 million. By summer, $6 million. The final projection approached £10 million per ship. The American Essex-class fleet carriers, the ships that won the Pacific War, were 872 feet long, displaced 36,000 tons fully loaded, carried 90 to 100 aircraft, and made 32.7 knots. They could be built in as little as 14 months. 24 were completed during the war. Each cost between $68 and $78 million. The American Casablanca-class escort carriers were even more damning. 512 feet long, 10,900 tons displacement. 27 aircraft, 19 knots. 50 were built in under 2 years. Some were completed in as little as 3 months. They were small, they were slow by fleet carrier standards, but they closed the Atlantic gap. They provided exactly the air cover Habakkuk was designed to deliver, at a fraction of the cost, in a fraction of the time. 2 Essex-class carriers operating together would have surpassed Habakkuk's aircraft capacity, at roughly 3% of its displacement and 5 times the speed. A dozen Casablanca-class escort carriers would have carried more aircraft, operated at triple the speed, and been built faster than a single ice ship. Sir Charles Goodeve, Assistant Controller of Research and Development at the Admiralty, made the decisive calculation. The 40,000 tons of cork, the thousands of miles of steel tubing, and the 4 power stations required for each Habakkuk ship would consume more steel than building the entire carrier out of steel in the first place. Perutz himself later confirmed it. The material meant to save steel would have consumed more of it. C.J. Mackenzie, president of Canada's National Research Council, concluded that the full-size vessel would cost more money and machinery than a whole fleet of conventional aircraft carriers. He added that British promoters were so intimidated by Churchill that they kept this information from him as costs spiraled. The mathematics were devastating. For the estimated final cost of a single Habakkuk, the Allies could build approximately 12 to 15 Casablanca-class escort carriers. Those 15 escort carriers would collectively carry over 400 aircraft, operate at nearly triple the speed, deploy across the entire Atlantic simultaneously, and be completed in less time than a single ice ship. The comparison was not close. Habakkuk was an ingenious solution to a problem that mass production solved faster and cheaper. The strategic rationale collapsed with equal speed. May 1943, Black May, broke the U-boat campaign. Allied forces destroyed 41 U-boats in a single month, more than in the first 3 years of the war combined. From April through June, 100 U-boats were sunk. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Dunitz ordered the withdrawal of most U-boats from the North Atlantic. The gap closed through conventional means. Very long-range B-24 Liberators equipped with 10-centimeter radar and Lee lights finally deployed in sufficient numbers. Escort carriers sailed with convoys. Hunter-killer groups roamed the Atlantic. Portugal granted permission for Allied use of airfields in the Azores. Improved tactics, high-frequency direction finding, hedgehog mortars, and acoustic homing torpedoes compounded the advantage. For several months after Black May, 62 merchant convoys crossed the Atlantic without losing a single ship. The final meeting on Project Habakkuk was held in December 1943. The official conclusion was terse. The large Habakkuk Mark II made of Pykrete has been found to be impractical because of the enormous production resources required and technical difficulties involved. At Patricia Lake, the refrigeration was switched off at the end of August 1943. The prototype took 3 full Canadian summers to melt completely. Structural remnants finally sank by approximately 1946. Geoffrey Pyke did not live to see his concept become a historical footnote. After Mountbatten left combined operations in October 1943 to command in Southeast Asia, Pyke lost his patron and his position. He grew increasingly depressed. On the evening of February 21, 1948, at his lodgings in Hampstead, London, the 54-year-old shaved his beard and took a bottle of sleeping pills. His Times obituary praised him. He remained always the knight-errant. Because of the very greatness of his ideas, most of his life was one of frustration and disappointment. Think back to that memorandum arriving on Mountbatten's desk in the autumn of 1942. 232 pages proposing an aircraft carrier made of frozen sawdust. The admirals who laughed at it were not entirely wrong. The ship would have been too slow, too expensive, and too resource-hungry to justify construction. But the critics who called it a fantasy were wrong. The material was real. Pykrete stopped bullets that shattered ordinary ice. It resisted axes that split timber. It survived a Canadian summer on a single 1-horsepower motor. It took 3 years to melt after the power was cut. The skeptics who said ice could never serve as armor were wrong. The bureaucrats who dismissed Pyke as a crank were wrong. The committee members who assumed frozen water could not be engineered into a structural material were wrong. What killed Habakkuk was not bad science. It was good timing. The Battle of the Atlantic turned before the ice carrier could be built. Escort carriers, long-range aircraft, and improved tactics closed the gap that Habakkuk was designed to fill. The war moved faster than the ice. Decades later, the science was tested again. In 2009, the television program Mythbusters confirmed Pykrete's properties under controlled conditions. The reinforced ice stopped a .45 caliber bullet, while ordinary ice shattered. It supported over 300 pounds of weight, while ice failed at 40. The team built a Pykrete boat that reached 23 miles per hour before the material began deteriorating without refrigeration. The BBC built a 20-foot Pykrete vessel and sailed it across the Solent estuary in 2010. The material works. It always worked. That was never the question. Today, the remains of the Patricia Lake prototype lie on the lake bottom at a depth of 26 to 43 meters on a 30-degree slope. Wooden walls, refrigeration pipes, cold air ductwork, bitumen insulation. In 1988, the Alberta Underwater Archaeology Society installed an underwater bronze plaque and a concrete cairn near the wreck. A second plaque marks the shoreline. About 20 divers visit each year. 2,000 feet of frozen ambition reduced to timber and pipes at the bottom of a mountain lake. A monument to the moment when Britain was desperate